In this module, I'd like us to implement all of the design of our paparazzi application without any backends or any functionality at all. I like implementing things that way, so without being tied to a backend first, because we can move a lot faster, and very often it actually gives you ideas for functionalities to implement. So throughout this module, we're going to implement our design page by page, and every time we need some data to display to our frontend, we're going to mock that using stubs. And on today's episode, we will do two things. We will start by designing the layout of our application, and we will create our first stubs, which is going to be the authentication stub. Okay, so regarding the layout of our application, what I usually do before I start coding is stretch a few ideas on my iPad. I usually use a big stroke on the pencil to force myself not to focus too much on the details. So here is a very rough sketch of what I want the layout of our application to look like. I want to have a navbar with the logo and the title of the application on the left side. And because we won't have so much space on smaller screens, we'll hide the title of the application on mobiles. For the right side of the navbar, it will depend whether the user is authenticated or not. If it is, we'll display its name and a logout button. And if it's not, we'll simply display a login and a register button. Okay, so let's implement that. In our app.view component, we're going to remove everything and start from scratch. Because the navbar is on top of the content of our application, we'll use a vertical flex container. So flex col, and we want the height of this container to take the entire screen, so h screen. Okay, so inside that container we'll have two things. We'll have the navbar and the content. And as you can see, they're already stacking on top of each other. Now we'll give our navbar a full width, a white background, and a border button. For the content, we wanted to use all of the space that's left available, and we also want the user to only scroll inside that space. So for those reasons, we'll write flex1 and overflow scroll. Now inside that space, we're going to create a centered container. So div container mx_auto. And for us to see a little bit better what's happening, let me add a panel inside that container. Okay, so our container is actually working, which means if I increase that, you can see we have a centered container in the middle of our page. It's just that when it's too small, the container takes the full width of the page, so we need to add some spacing. So we'll give an horizontal padding of 4 and a vertical padding of 8. And when the screen is big enough, we'll give a vertical padding of 16 to make our UI breathe a little bit more. Okay, so now that we have a very rough layout of our application, let's design the inside of our navbar. Because there's going to be quite a lot of content there, I'm already going to extract that navbar into its own component. So I'm going to cut this and write the navbar. And by the way, the prefix is a known Vue.js convention when you want to avoid using only one word for naming components. It's not a base component because we're not going to reuse it in a lot of places, but it's a brick of our layout, so we'll call it the navbar. The same would apply if we had a header or a footer, we'll call it the header or the footer. Okay, so let's register that component. And we'll add it in our components directory. Okay, so inside that white background, we are also going to add a centered container so that it is aligned with our content. So we'll write container mx_auto px4 and we'll give it a vertical padding of 3. Okay, so now the content of our navbar is aligned with the content of our pages. And let's make the text of our navbar a little bit lighter. So text gray 600. Okay, now let's design our logo on the left side of the navbar. We'll create a flex container that contains an image and some text. And regarding the image, I've actually already added the logo in public image logo.png. And that's just a logo that I purchased on Shutterstock that I thought would look nice for our paparazzi application. So let's add that logo in our navbar. Image/logo.png. It's a logo and we'll give it a width of 12. Perfect. Next, for the title, we'll give it a little bit more space, so ML4. And let's make it uppercase, so uppercase, tracking, widest. And let's make it a tiny bit bolder, so font medium. Because we're going to make sure that clicking on that logo is going to redirect us to the home page, let's give it a cursor pointer. And let's also make sure that the text becomes darker when we hover it. So text gray 900. One last thing for the logo, we said we didn't want the name of our app to be displayed on smaller screens. So we'll say make it hidden by default and display it when the screen is big enough. So now if I increase this, our title appears, but if it's really small, then we can't see it anymore. Okay, so now for the right part of our navbar, we're going to pretend that our user is not logged in, and we're going to display the login and register button. So we'll create 2 A tags, one for logging in, and one for registering. For now, we'll make them point to nothing, so hashtag here and here. And we're going to make them a bit bolder, so font medium, like the title of our app, and make them darker when we hover on top of them. Okay, so that's good, except that they are not on the right side of the navbar. So we'll also make the container of the navbar a flex container. So flex items center, and we'll give the login button a margin left auto, so that the left margin is automatically as big as it can possibly be. And finally, we'll add some space between login and register by adding ML4. Okay, so that part here is our logo, and that part here is if the user is a guest. Now let's prepare our navbar for what should be displayed if the user is authenticated. So we will wrap that in a template tag. We will copy that. And we will toggle them with a boolean, so v if true, v else, and this is going to be the authenticated part. So if we are authenticated, we don't want a login button, but we want the name of the user, so let's say John Doe. This no longer needs to be a link, so we can replace a with div, and remove the href, and all of that. And instead of register, we need logout. Okay, so now we have both cases. If I leave this to true, then we'll see the navbar as if the user was authenticated. And if I put that to false, we'll see the navbar as if the user was logged out. So now instead of having that toggle directly in the template of our navbar, I think it would be nice to create an authentication stub that takes care of that for us. And by authentication stub, all I mean is an object with a user defined in it and a boolean that says is authenticated or is not. Okay, so let's create a new directory called stubs, and inside we'll add a host.js file. That file will define an object with an authenticated boolean, which will default to true for now. Now we can add all of the methods that would be useful for our frontend. A first very easy method would be the check method, similarly to what we have in Laravel, that will return this.authenticated. Another one that we'll need is the user method. That should return the user if it is authenticated and null otherwise. So first we'll create a dummy user, so user equals John Doe, and its email will be john.doe@gmail.com. And now if the user is authenticated, we can return the user object, otherwise we will return null. Okay, so now we've created a useful stub with two methods, check and users, that our application can use a little bit everywhere. And if we need to pretend that our user is logged out in our entire application, all we need to do is replace this true by false. Okay, so let's go back to our navbar.view component and use that authentication stub. So we're going to import it down here by writing import auth from stub/auth. And we'll make that stub available to our template through the data method. So data return auth. Okay, so now we can go back to our template and replace false with auth.check. And if this returns true, it means that we will return a user if we do auth.user. So let's replace John Doe with what we have on the stub. So vtext equals auth.user.name. Okay, so now if I go back to my authentication stub and I replace false with true, you can see that we're now logged in as John Doe. And if I go back to false, we are logged out. Okay, so I think we've made very good progress in this episode. But before we wrap up, as you probably know by now, I'm a big fan of Webpack aliases, so let's add one for the stubs directory. We'll start by creating an index.js file inside that directory, so index.js. And all that's going to do is export the authentication stub as a variable called auth. So we'll say export default as auth from auth. Now we can go to our Webpack config file and add a third alias called stubs. And we will leave the $ here because we've created an index.js file that encapsulates the logic of the stubs directory. Now all that's left to do is go back to our Navbar component and update our import statement with import auth from stubs. And because we've created a new alias, we need to restart hot reloading. Okay, so as you can see, the advantage of having the @stubs alias is that you can really see it as like an external library where you can pick up everything that you need inside. So for example, in the future, when we create our paparazzi stub, we'll be able to use it just like that, auth/paparazzi. Okay, so just to double check that everything works, let's remove that and go back to our auth stub and transform false to true and make sure that John Doe is logged in. Yep, and that back to false. Okay, everything works. Okay, we've done a lot in this episode, so let's have a quick recap. We've restarted our app.view component from scratch and designed the layout of our application. In that layout, we've created a new component that defines the navbar of our application. And because the design of that navbar depends on whether the user is authenticated or not, we've created an authentication stub that tells our entire application whether we have a logged in user or not. And finally, we created a Webpack alias for the stubs directory. In the next episode, we will use view router to make sure we can have multiple pages in our single page application.